Hello, and welcome to another Seth book analysis stream. I'm Poetic Heretic, and we are indeed continuing our analysis of Volume 2 of The Unknown Reality, a Seth book by Jane Roberts. As usual, I will be both reading and commenting on the material. Okay, our audio is good. Seth is going to talk more about astrology tonight, in addition to other topics, so it should be very fascinating. So let our critical analysis of this book continue. Session 730, January 15th, 1975, 9:17 p.m., Wednesday. As we lay in bed after last Monday's session, Jane told me, "I've got it. From Seth, I think. A really complete astrological chart would have to include not only the time of your birth, but that of your death." Ooh, that was a quote from Jane, which would pose a few obstacles, I thought, as I fell asleep. This evening, Jane had many thoughts and images before the session got underway. Quote, "It's about astrology. Actually, I mean, it's about the birth of consciousness," end quote. Incidentally, for those who may be wondering, there is a technique in astrology called the length of life technique or something like that, where you can literally use astrology to, supposedly at least, determine the length of a person's life. Now, I don't know what it is. I haven't looked it up and I haven't tried it for myself, but apparently it is something you can do, and I think it's a rather ancient technique as well. So that's kind of insane to think that through astrology one could literally figure out the time of their death. But then Seth is apparently saying here that to have a really complete astrological chart, it would have to include not only the time of your birth, but that of your death. Well, what if you could figure that out through astrology as we know it and have known it for thousands of years? Or at least as we have known it ever since that technique was discovered. I don't know. Wonder what Seth would have to say about that. Anyway. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. Usually you think in terms of a hypothetical whole self or consciousness emerging at birth and disappearing at death. There are, however, learned arguments in which professors debate such questions. Some astrologers use the time of conception in their calculations, while others prefer the date of birth. Various religions have decided that the quote-unquote soul enters the fetus at its conception, while others argue that consciousness cannot be considered a human soul until some time later, just prior to birth. The same kind of questions occur at the other end of the scale. When does death actually come? In most of these debates, this hypothetical self or consciousness is taken as the measure. Give us a moment. In the first place, again, the self or soul in this case is not a thing of measurement, nor is it necessarily some underlined thing that suddenly arrives and then disappears. The physical self as you know it is a underlined focus of consciousness that forms a personality in response to that focus. It is very difficult to make analogies here, but I am foolhardy enough to try it. Pause. It seems to you that any naturally aborted fetus has no physical life at all, that such life has been denied to it for some reason. Instead, the fetus experiences another level, physical life at a different scale, that in your terms would apply to the distant past. In, I repeat, underlined conventional ideas of evolution, this would be a period in which your kind of consciousness experimented with a water environment with fins instead of lungs. Footnote. Appendix 12 contains much material on conventional theories of evolution, as well as Seth's and my own often countering views. End of footnote. In certain terms, this gives the consciousness a look at particular portions of the species' quote unquote past. It also provides that consciousness with firsthand knowledge psychically and directly. Again, most difficult to explain! Exclamation point. Particularly without offending your ideas of selfhood, yet each of you, quote unquote, alive, died in just such a manner. While in conventional terms you think of long centuries' duration, in which finned creatures rose from the seas, some quote unquote becoming reptiles and finally mammals, many did not make that journey but quote unquote fell along the way. So, underlined in those terms, and following that analogy, the psyche makes the same kind of adjustments and life changes. You have each existed many times, then, as fetuses, quote unquote, who did not make it. Not necessarily because you did not want to be born, but because those experiences were in themselves legitimate, and in your present state are written in the quote unquote memory of your physical being. Footnote. While Seth was giving his material on the fetus, I found myself recalling some ideas I've mentioned to Jane at various times during the last couple of years, and have written about briefly. I think it very likely that aborted fetuses and those infants who die early in quote unquote life, say within a few months after birth, especially, never intended to stay long within camouflage or physical reality to begin with. The consciousnesses within those small human structures came just to momentarily sample our world of matter, whether from inside the womb or out of it. Considering their viewpoints, it's not tragic that they quote unquote die unborn, or at such young ages, although in ordinary terms the parents involved will almost certainly mourn deeply. Perhaps these notions will be of some limited comfort to those who have written us with related questions. But for such consciousnesses, the bulk of their activities will be elsewhere, possibly in other probable realities, possibly in non-physical realities that we can hardly imagine from our own vantage points. Those who die unborn or young choose to touch upon physical reality to fulfill certain needs. They glimpse it as one might a view through the window of a passing automobile. I really believe that those quote-unquote certain needs can have vast implications, by the way, but this isn't the place to attempt a discussion of such aspects of reality. Of course, these ideas would apply to any form of life as we ordinarily think of that quality. They would be a commonplace in the animal world, for instance. Witness the quick deaths of certain newborn kittens in a litter, as Jane and I have, or consider the puppy in an animal shelter or pound, certain to be put to death in a few days if no one gives it a home. The young dog won't live long, yet I think that in its own way it must understand that great quote-unquote risk. For specific reasons, its consciousness decided upon its brief look into temporal reality. This kind of thinking usually reminds me of a certain statement Seth made half a dozen years ago. See Note 7 for Session 727, quote, "Creatures without the compartment of the ego can easily follow their own identity beyond any change of form," end quote. Seth's discussion in this evening's 730th session also reminded me of an article I'd clipped from a metropolitan newspaper in 1974. The gist of the piece is that each year in this country, an estimated several thousand seriously defective infants are quietly left to die without treatment, after most careful consideration by the parents and doctors involved. On a more personal level, Jane herself naturally aborted a 3-month-old fetus less than a year after our marriage in 1954, and 9 years before she initiated these sessions. Seth has said very little about this event, nor have we asked him to. He did remark some time ago in a private session that the miscarriage spontaneously came about because the personality inhabiting the fetus, quote unquote, changed its mind and withdrew from the physical world. At some indefinite date, we do plan to invite Seth to discuss the whole situation in detail. End of footnote. Intently at 9:36. Now, this does not mean that your personality as you know it was often trapped within a womb, destined to die there, or that a hypothetical whole self would not be born. It means that the archaeology of your psyche, as it is physically focused, carries those experiences. The self is not, pause, eyes closed. Give us a moment. I am searching for a good analogy. The self is not like a clay figure coming from a potter's oven, so that you can say, ah, here is a self, and nothing can be added to it. You have always existed as a probable self, though you are not focused in the knowledge of your own experience. In parentheses, you may have been focused quite well in other realities, but I am speaking of your earthly existence as you understand it. At any point now, you can literally become more yourself. In that regard, you are born underlined by degrees. In certain terms, you have discarded portions of yourself, so you died by degrees, but the two, the living and the dying, occur at once. To a certain extent, what you are was latent in the fetus, but there is no one point when, quote, the full awareness of the soul enters into the flesh, end quote. The process is gradual. In physical terms, it begins before your own parents are born. Give us a moment. Long pause. The chart of events at the time of your quote-unquote birth is like one small snapshot of someone's backyard in the afternoon. Herein underlined this analogy, the entire earthly personality could be compared to the underlined world. Now, as long as you make your deductions according to that one picture, there will be correlations that apply, but only to that small specific area. In your terms, the person at birth is affected by multidimensional conditions, and the collective position of the planets is but one very minute indication of the other realities involved. Rupert is correct. Even in conventional terms, a true horoscope would have to involve the time of death in your temporal reality, as well as that of birth. Your focus of attention forms boundaries that predispose you to believe in a point at which your consciousness emerges, as you understand it, and a point when it is no longer effective or dies. Your beliefs in such concepts limit your perception, for by altering the focus of your attention, you can, to some extent, become aware of perception before and after the recognized points of birth and death. You grant soulhood only to your own species, as if souls had sizes that fit your own natures only. You preserve these ideas by thinking of animals as beneath you. Then, however, you must wonder when the soul enters the flesh, or when the alien fetus becomes one of your own, and therefore blessed by the gods and granted the right to live. But all things have consciousness, and in those terms possess a soul nature. There are no gradations as to soul. Soul is the life within everything that is. Of course, the fetus, quote unquote, has a soul. But in the same way, if you think in those terms, then each underlined cell within the fetus must be granted a soul. Leaning forward with humorous emphasis, voice deeper. The course of a cell is not predetermined. Cells are usually very cooperative, particularly as they form the structures of the body. Footnote. All 200 billion, approximately, of them. End of footnote. I need a sip of water real quick. It's interesting filming or broadcasting this at this time of the day, 6:45, because the clocks just changed and now it's like already dark out, and it was dark out when I started filming. It's been dark out since before I started filming, so I guess a lot of our Seth streams are probably going to be during the nighttime now, from now on, except for when I do them more in the early afternoon, depending on like when I have my therapy sessions, because those can vary. Anyway, 10:02. Give us a moment. But the body is a context that they have chosen to experience. In fulfilling themselves, the cells aid your own existence, but in a framework they have chosen. They can reject certain elements within their existences, however, change their courses, or even form new alliances. They have great freedom within what you think of as the framework of your reality. If underlined, their paths cannot be charted and can indeed constantly surprise you, then why do you think that underlined your course can be mapped out ahead of time by reading the positions of the stars at your birth? Oh boy, Seth is getting pointed to the details now. The cells are not inferior as far as you are concerned, even though they form part of the structure of your physical being. They are not even less conscious, emphatically. They are conscious in a different fashion. There is no need to, quote unquote, romanticize them or to think of them as little people, but each of them possesses a highly focused consciousness underlined and a consciousness of self. You like to think, again, that only your own species possesses an awareness of its own selfhood. There are different kinds of selfhood and an infinite variety of ways to experience self-awareness. One little comment I can make here about what Seth is saying, and I'm not sure if this is specifically what he is getting at by what he just said in the last paragraph, but this idea, as I have said before, I'm sure, that astrology somehow maps the entire course of your life down to every last detail is really missing the whole point of astrology, or the whole idea of astrology, at least as I understand it and as many, many other people understand it. Now, there may be some out there who do still believe that astrology is a much more like fated thing, that you pretty much have a fate and it's going to happen no matter what you do, and free will is an illusion. I don't believe that, and as far as I know, most modern astrologers don't believe that. And if that's what Seth is getting at, then basically I agree with what he's saying. Like, astrology, as I said in the last stream about this, only is a system of probabilities and potentialities. It is not something that will tell you like what you're going to eat for breakfast tomorrow. So. But anyway, let's continue. With much animation. As an example, it underlined appears to you that animals do not reflect upon their own reality. Certainly it seems that a cell has no quote-unquote objective knowledge of its own being, as if it is without knowing what it is, or without appreciation of its own isness. You are quite wrong in such deductions, nor are there necessarily gradations in which one kind of consciousness progresses in rigid terms from a lower to a higher state. Any cell has practical use of precognitive abilities, for example, that quite escape you, yet many of you assign such abilities to quote-unquote higher souls. Footnote. Quote, the cells precognate, end quote. See note 3 for the 727th session. End of footnote. Each kind of life has its own qualities that cannot be compared with those of others, and that often cannot be underlined communicated. Now, all of this may seem to have little to do with the nature of reincarnation, as you think of it, or with counterparts as I have explained them. Yet it is vital that you throw aside old concepts of the self and of the soul before you can begin to understand the freedom of your own selfhood. Are you tired? 10:18. No. Actually, I was, but Jane was doing so well as Seth that I hated to interrupt her delivery of the material. Kind of like how I am so tired right now, but do not want to stop doing this because it is so enjoyable. Stop me when you want to. This evening, Rupert read some just published material about dolphins and whales. It contained strong hints that those creatures are geniuses, possessing the ability of abstract thought to a high degree. Footnote. The superior intellectual and altruistic characteristics of dolphins and other cetaceans are well known, if barely understood in detail. Seth commented on dolphins some 10 months ago in his final delivery for the 688th session in Volume 1 of Unknown Reality. He cited them as being not only similar to certain species that had lived on our own planet in the far past, but as representing bleed-throughs from probable realities in which water-dwelling mammals predominate. Note 9 for the 688th session contains a description of Jane's work on an early unfinished novel, To Hear a Dolphin, which she began a couple of months before Seth first came through in late 1963. End of footnote. They are not higher or lower than your own species. They simply represent a different kind of selfhood. Now, there is some relationship, at least in terms of our discussion, between the reality of the dolphins and the reality of the fetus. In your terms, the fetus lives in primeval conditions, reminiscent of periods in the species' past. It relates in its own way to its environment. Now, for some consciousnesses, this is sufficient. Underlined in your terms, again, for each of you, it underlined was sufficient. Give us a moment and rest your fingers. Pause from 1025 to 1027. The soul is not a unit that is definable. It is instead an underlined undefinable quality. It cannot be broken down or built up, destroyed or expanded, yet it can change affiliation and organization and its characteristics while ever remaining itself. The soul within the fetus cannot be destroyed by any kind of abortion, for instance. Its progress cannot be charted, for it will always escape such calculations. Its history is in the future, which always creates the past. Take your break. 1031. Jane was out of her very excellent trance at once. That was one of those times when the material was coming through so great that I could have continued until morning. That feeling of freedom is fantastic, she said, then tried an analogy. I'm as free as a great runner who breaks a world record when her chest hits the tape. Not only that, Jane now had several other channels of data available from Seth. God, I get impatient, she exclaimed, but in physical reality I can get only one of them at a time, and you can write just one sentence at a time. Footnote. Jane first experienced the multiple channel effect with Seth not long after she began delivering personal reality. See session 616 for chapter 2. End of footnote. Oh, forget it, Seth, she added, half laughing, for that quote-unquote energy personality essence was ready with comments on what she just told me. Jane got up and walked around the living room where we were holding the session. When she went into the kitchen, she picked up more from Seth on astrology. As break neared its end, Jane said that Seth was going to give the material available through one of the other channels open from him tonight. This decision was strictly her own, of course, and was motivated by a very successful out-of-body experience she'd had last night following ESP class. Jane was especially happy that today she had found interesting correlations with part of her adventure through a friend, Mary, who was also a class member. Returning at 10:54, then, Seth not only came through with the material Jane wanted, but devoted considerable time to some other information for her. Footnote. For some reason, the link to it is not working, so one moment. I can add later that in Chapter 17 of Psychic Politics, Jane presented both her own notes on her out-of-body experience and the material Seth gave on it the next evening in the 730th session. As noted during the last session break, Jane had tuned into additional Seth material on astrology. I now add, with regret, that information was never recorded. End of footnote. He ended the session at 11:45 p.m. All right, so that is indeed the end of that session. And I'd love to stay for longer and analyze the next session as well. But, well, let's see. Hang on. I might be able to. It says the next one's only 24 minutes and it's currently 6:56 p.m. Well, let us see here. We're only 25 minutes into this stream. I guess we better keep going. But in that case, I am going to take just a moment to share this on Twitter. So fast forward by a minute or so if you're watching when this is not live and want to just get back to the material. So yeah, that is fairly unfortunate then that they couldn't get Seth's additional comments on astrology. I wonder what they were. And it seemed he had more to say too. I kind of got the feeling that he was. Let's see, what should I tweet? Live with more Seth / Gene Roberts analysis stuff. All right, whatever. These books are just endlessly fascinating to me, to the point that I'll probably keep doing these streams for a long time to come, these Seth streams. Okay, the tweet looks good. I don't think they're the most popular or interesting to a lot of other people on my channel, but I like doing them, so that's all that really matters, is doing what you like to do. All right, so let us resume. Session 731, January 20th, 1975, 9:38 p.m., Monday. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation, slowly and quietly. Your present idea of identity is maintained only because you grant as valid such small aspects of your own reality. In other words, you accepted concepts of selfhood. Correction. Your accepted concepts of selfhood would disappear if you ever allowed any significant subjective experience to intrude. Quote unquote, the absent self, the absent or unknown self, is the portion of your own existence that you do not ordinarily perceive or accept, though there is within you a longing for it. Much of unknown reality is involved with the breaking up of theories that underlined have been long accepted, but that prevent you from perceiving the powerful nature of those absent portions of the self. As you focus upon certain details from a larger field of physical reality, so then you focus upon only the small portion of yourself that you consider quote unquote real. You carry within you, however, the deep knowledge of experience that in your terms would be prior, yet in your cells and your own deeper mind, such information is current. Give us a moment. Selfhood overspills with great luxurious outcroppings, yet you jealously guard against such creativity. To a certain extent, you do carry the knowledge of your forefathers within your cell's chromosomes, which present a pattern that is not rigid but flexible, one that in codified fashion endows you with the subjective living experience of those who, in your terms, have gone before. Footnote. As defined in Note 9 for Session 682 in Volume 1 of Unknown Reality, quote, chromosomes are microscopic bodies into which the protoplasmic substance of a cell nucleus separates during cell division. They carry the genes, the factors or units, quote unquote, blueprints that determine hereditary characteristics. In volume, end of that quote, by the way, in Volume 2, see Note 14 for Appendix 12. End of footnote. As Rupert recently suspected, some very old cultures have been aware of this. Period. Footnote. After the session, Jane told me she'd had the thought during an idle moment early last week, but had forgotten to mention it. She wasn't able to elaborate upon her original idea now. End of footnote. While being independent individuals, their members also identified with their ancestors to some extent, accepting them as portions of their selfhoods. This does not mean that the individual self was underlined less, but was underlined more aware of its own reality. A completely different kind of focus was presented, in which the ancestors were understood to contribute to the quote-unquote new experience of the living, one in which the physically focused consciousness clearly saw itself as perceiving the world for itself, but also for all of those who had gone before. Gradually louder for emphasis, while realizing that in those terms he or she would contribute as well as the generations past. The animals were also accepted in this natural philosophy of selfhood as the individual plainly saw the living quality of consciousness. The characteristics of the animals were understood to continue quote-unquote life, adding their qualities to the experience of the self in a new way. Footnote. Seth packed a lot of information into the short 689th session for Volume 1. He discussed the innumerable experiments of consciousness with animal man and man animal forms, the great communication between man and animal in ancient times, and the deep rapport of both with their natural heritage, psychic and biological blueprints, and cellular precognition, the growth of man's ego consciousness, the beginnings of our God concepts and mythology, and more. End of footnote. You had better put life in quotes in that last sentence. Pause. The human body would be used in Earth's great husbandry as, from it, dying and decaying new forms would arise. This was a give and take in which, for instance, a jungle neighborhood was truly home, and all was a portion of the self psychically, spiritually, and physically. Footnote. In Volume 1, see the 687th session at 1045, when Seth said, quote, biologically the man knows he has come from the earth. Some of his cells have been the cells of animals, and the animal knows he will look out through a man's eyes, end quote. Then see Note 3 for that session, especially Jane's poem, Illumination. End of footnote. Pause at 957. Let those who will laugh at tales of spirits turning into the trees. A simplistic theory, certainly, yet a symbolic statement in such societies. The dead were buried at home in the same close territory, to form in later times the very composition of the ground upon which religions grew. Footnote. For some related tree material, see Note 7 for session 727. End of footnote. Again, your limited concepts of selfhood make what I am saying difficult for you to perceive. With emphasis. I am underlined not saying, for example, that the living consciousness of each individual returned to the earth literally, but that the physical material permeated and stamped with that consciousness did and does. Again, even the cells retain knowledge of all of their affiliations. In physical terms, the consciousness that you understand is based upon this. Give us a moment. Selfhood is poorer when it does not at least intuitively understand this heritage. Give us a moment. Underlined, those intimate realizations, however, had to be counterbalanced in line with certain purposes set by your species, and even for that matter momentarily set aside so that other abilities and characteristics could emerge. The species' sense of curiosity would not allow it to stay in any home territory for long, and so the sense of intimacy was purposely broken. Footnote. In Volume 1, see the material from 1049 to 1122 for the 684th session. In Volume 2, see the 716th session, for instance. End of footnote. It would become highly important again, however, when the planet was populated extensively, as it is now. Only the original feeling of home area has to be extended over the face of the Earth. The quote unquote absent portions of the self are ready to emerge. The other, to you probable, lines of consciousness can now come into play. These different lines of focus will each show you other aspects of your own reality as individuals and as a species. Take your break. (1013 to 1029). I said once that no knowledge exists outside of consciousness. Footnote. Seth evidently referred to the material he gave on the conscious attributes of information for Chapter 3 of Personal Reality. Note 1 for Session 697 in Volume 1 contains quotations from those comments, as well as a few other references. Actually, Seth has been describing in various ways the indissoluble, that's an interesting word, the indissoluble relationship between consciousness and information, or consciousness and anything else, ever since Jane began holding the sessions over a decade ago. I tried a little experiment. From the more than 64 three-ring binders, or volumes, as we call them, that hold the typed transcripts of our sessions, I picked out the second binder. Within it were sessions 16 to 23 inclusive, covering the period from January 15th to February 5th, 1964. 5 of the 8 sessions contain material applicable to this note. Seth, in the 18th session, for example, quote, "As you have probably supposed by now, there is consciousness in everything, visible or invisible to you. Each fragment of the universe has a consciousness of its own. Pain and pleasure, the strongest aspects of all consciousnesses, are experienced by every fragment, according to its degree. Differentiation is, of course, various, and it is in the degree of differentiation that consciousnesses are different." End quote. End of footnote. In those terms, neutral data are not transferred through the chromosomes. Consciousness underlined passes on information through quote-unquote living vehicles. Whether physically materialized or not, knowledge is possessed by consciousness. It is underlined always quote-unquote individualized, pause, though not necessarily in your terms. Footnote. Someday, I'd like Seth to enlarge upon the tantalizing implications contained within this statement. End of footnote. Give us a moment. The information carried by the chromosomes is underlined not general, but highly specific. It is codified data underlined itself alive that contains within it the essence of ancestral knowledge. Change that to ancestral underlined experience of underlined specific ancestral experience. Biologically, you do indeed carry within you, then, the memories of your particular ancestors. These form a underlined partial basis for your subjective and physical existence, and provide the needed support for it. Since one portion of your heritage is physical, in those terms, those memories can be translated again back into emotional and psychological events, though usually they are not in your societies. To that extent, the so-called past experience of your ancestors and of your species is concurrent with your own, biologically speaking. That, I want to say this, but it actually says that, and well, that was weird. That is but one line, however, covered by the chromosomes. You have, quote-unquote, another line of existence that also serves as a support for the one that you presently recognize. It includes, oh dear, it says the connection is unstable. One moment while I verify if that is correct or incorrect. One moment. Now look, it's back. Are we back?
Are we back?
Okay, good. I literally thought that that we were disconnected there, and that was just going to have to be the end of this stream. But fortunately, we're still here. We have survived. The unknown reality goes on. All right, so where were we? Let me just restart this paragraph in case anything was lost. To that extent, the so-called past experience of your ancestors and of your species is concurrent with your own, biologically speaking. That is but one line, however, covered by the chromosomes. You have, quote-unquote, another line of existence that also serves as a support for the one that you presently recognize. It includes other interweaving physical relationships that bind you with all others upon your planet at the same adjacent level of time. That is, to some extent or another, you are related to all of those alive upon the planet. You are underlined time contemporaries. You will have a far closer relationship with some than with others. Some will be your counterparts. 1045. Give us a moment. These may or may not be closer to you than family relationships, but psychically speaking, they will share a certain kind of history with you. You will also be connected through the physical framework of the Earth in the large give and take of its space-time scheme. A third line supporting your selfhood, as you think of it, is the reincarnational one. Footnote. When Seth mentions reincarnation now, I usually think of a certain delivery of his in Volume 1. After 1045 in the 683rd session, see the paragraph of material beginning with this phrase, quote, underlined, reincarnation simply represents probabilities in a time context. End quote. Also see note 3 for that session. End of footnote. This is somewhat like the ancestral line, long pause, and there are also reflections in the genes and chromosomes undetected by your scientists. The ancestral and reincarnational lines merge to some extent to form what you underlined think of as your genetic patterns ahead of time, so to speak. Before this life, you chose what you wished from those two main areas. Reincarnational experience is also transmitted, then, and can be retranslated from a biological code imprint into emotional awareness. Again, however, as you are not your parents or your ancestors, you are not your quote-unquote reincarnational selves. Here also ideas of time hamper you, for I must explain all of this in temporal terms. Since time is simultaneous, at other levels your ancestors knew of your birth, though they died centuries ago in recognized continuity. The same applies to reincarnational existences that you think of as occurring in the past. You cannot say that your ancestors, like some strange plants, were growing toward what you are, or that you are the sum of their experiences. They underlined, are themselves. You cannot say that underlined you are the sum of your past reincarnational lives either, and for the same reasons. You cut off the knowledge of yourself, and so divisions seem to occur. You are somewhat like a plant that recognizes only one of its leaves at a time. A leaf feels its deeper reality as a part of the plant, and adds to its own sense of continuity, and even to its own sense of individuality. But you often pretend that you are some odd dangling leaf with no roots, growing without a plant to support you. Yeah, it sounds kind of like what the ego or ego consciousness likes to do, doesn't it? It's like it doesn't want to accept that it's a part of some greater thing, some greater entity, even in just regular, like, human terms, like a greater self. It's like, no, I am in control. It's like, well, sorry, but not really. Jane, as Seth pointed to the angel wing begonia, what the hell is that? That sat on the narrow coffee table separating us. All of the leaves now growing on this plant could be thought of as counterparts of each other, each alive and individual in one time, each contributing yet facing in different directions. As one leaf falls, another takes its place. Until next year, the whole plant, still living, will have a new set of leaves, future reincarnational selves of this batch. Reminds me of my plants here in this very room, my succulents. I need to pluck some dying leaves off of those currently. You are not plants, but the analogy is a simple one, and if you will forgive me, overall it holds water. Amused. Take your break. 11:06 to 11:25. Speaking of water, there is a constant interaction in the plant between its parts that you do not perceive. The leaves now present are biologically valid, interrelating in your terms. Yet, in underlined time terms, each leaf is also aware of the past history of the plant, and biologically they spring up from that quote unquote past. Each leaf seeks to express its leafhood as fully as possible. Leaves take in sun, which helps the plant itself grow. Parentheses, through photosynthesis. The development of the leaves, then, is very important to the plant's own existence. The cells of the plant are kept in contact with the environment through the leaves' experiences, and future probabilities are always taken into consideration. The smallest calculations involving light and dark are known. The life of the plant and its leaves cannot be separated. Yeah, Seth is saying leaves take in sun, which help the plant itself grow. It makes me think, wait, let me see something. The development of the leaves, then, is very important to the plant's own existence. The cells of the plant are kept in contact with the environment through the leaves' experiences, and future probabilities are always taken into consideration. The smallest calculations involving light and dark are known. The life of the plant and its leaves cannot be separated. Well, what I'm thinking here is, first of all, speaking of like plants and my plants, I currently have at long last a grow light on the way to give my succulents some much needed light, especially as the days are waning here in the northern hemisphere. But with the stuff that Seth is like always saying, and sort of from what he's saying here, I almost wonder if Seth would say that my plants, even though theoretically they should have no way of quote unquote knowing that more light is on the way to them, that this growth is coming soon and will supplement their sunlight. I wonder if Seth would say that actually there is some kind of deep biological cellular awareness within the plants I have in this very room right here, right now, within every leaf or within every cell of every leaf of every plant, some awareness that more light is coming. I bet Seth would. I can just hear him now. Seth would be like, there is a deep biological awareness of the probability of et cetera, et cetera. Well, you hear that, plants over there? If you didn't know, if you could understand what I'm saying now, you would know now. Your grow light is on its way. Anyway, I'm so sleep deprived, I'm becoming a bit delirious, I think. Anyway, long pause. The plant has its own quote unquote idea of itself, in which each of its leaves has its part, yet each leaf has the latent capacities of the whole plant. Root 1, for instance, in a new plant will grow. Selves, spelled, have far greater freedom than leaves, but they can also root themselves if they choose, and they do. Reincarnational selves are like leaves that have left the plant, choosing a new medium of existence. In this analogy, the dropped leaves of the physical plant have fulfilled their own purposes to themselves as leaves, and to the plant. These selves, however, dropping from one branch of time, root themselves in another time, and become new plants from which others will sprout. Do you mean new selves instead of new plants? Correct. Wait a minute, so what did Seth say? And become new plants from which others will sprout. Do you mean new selves instead of new plants? Huh. So I guess Seth meant to actually say, but Rob just left it as it was, but then added that in. I guess what Seth actually meant to say was, these selves, however, dropping from one branch of time, root themselves in another time and become new selves from which others will sprout. Interesting. The larger self, then, seeds itself in time. In this process, no identity is lost and no identity is the same, yet all are interrelated. So you can theoretically expand your consciousness to include the knowledge of your past lives, though those lives were yours and not yours. They have a common root, as next year's leaves have a common root with the leaves now of this plant, pointing again to the begonia. Such knowledge, however, would automatically affect those past lives. Ideas of cause and effect can hold you back here, because it seems to you that the leaves of next year come as an effect caused by this year's leaves. Footnote. Besides quoting from the 18th session in Note 7 above, I presented I think it's supposed to say excerpts, on tree consciousness from the same session in Note 7 for session 727. Let me briefly continue that early Seth material here. Quote, in drawing up his list of so-called natural laws, I have said, in the 16th session, that man decided that what appeared to be cause and effect to him was, therefore, a natural law of the universe. Not only do these so-called laws, which are not laws, vary according to where you are in the universe, they also vary according to you underlined what you are in the universe. Therefore, your tree recognizes a human being, though it does not see the human being in your terms. To a tree, the laws are simply different. And if a tree wrote its laws of the universe, then you would know how different they are. End quote. And from the 521st session, after 1017, for chapter 4 of Seth Speaks, quote, the word result, you see, automatically infers cause and effect. The cause happening before the effect. And this is simply one small example of the strength of such distortions, and of the inherent difficulties involved with verbal thought, for it always implies a single-line delineation. End quote. End of footnote. To the plant and its innate creative pattern, however, all of its manifestations are one, an expression of itself, each portion different. The knowledge of its quote-unquote future leaves, as potential pattern, exists now. The same applies to the psyche. In that greater realm of reality, there is creative interplay and interrelationships between all aspects of selfhood. End of dictation and of session. My heartiest regards and a fond good evening. Thank you, Seth, and good night. 11:49 p.m. All right, and that is indeed the end of that session. Now I'm gonna wrap things up. So let me just take a sip of water, then I'll give a little preview of the next sessions that we'll likely analyze next week, and then I'll make a couple closing remarks on the astrology thing, just to sort of wrap that up. Again, I think I'm always going to wonder now, what was that extra material that Seth had on astrology but never got to deliver? I guess we'll never know. So let me just pull up the preview for next week. Come on, where the hell is it? Okay, here we go. Next week, session 732, your relationship with your counterparts, the importance of play and spontaneity, a list of the families of consciousness. And then session 733, more on counterparts, negative life conditions, Seth's world. Okay, cool. So just put my tablet over here. So as far as the astrology thing goes, if you really want my extensive thoughts on that, watch last week's stream, which is up on my channel in the appropriate Seth playlist. It's not hard to find. But just to sort of finalize my thoughts on that, and I also forgot to say this last week, I think. So regardless of Seth's perspective, or really anyone's perspective on astrology, the thing that I have found from working with it now for nearly 3.5 years, and that's especially in the last more than 2 years now, it's been every single day, multiple times a day working with it. The thing that I have found is that it has improved my life in so many ways. It has made things clear about myself and about other people, about the world around me, about events, whether personal or like in the world at large. It is a highly integrative discipline. It integrates any human experience possible. And I guess where I'm going with this, the overall point that I'm making is that I would say that even if we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that astrology is flawed, it still has value, in my opinion. And I would say it has immense value, especially, again, as an integrative practice and as a means of understanding things better. And if what Seth is saying, that basically astrology is correct but incomplete, I guess that's hopefully an accurate summary of what he's saying. If that could be somehow proven to be true, then I would say we simply accept that as part of our overall, how do I say this? We simply keep that in mind. If astrology is not the full story, then we should simply keep that in mind as we're looking at our birth charts or analyzing the astrological conditions of a particular event, or looking at someone else's birth chart, or anything working with astrology. As far as this idea of like, there are so many more probabilities than astrology implies, I don't know about that, because again, the way that I have pretty much always worked with astrology is to use it itself as a system of probabilities, of potentialities. And so I'm already, when I like interpret someone's birth chart or the astrology of a given day or a specific time of day or whatever, I'm already factoring in this idea of like, okay, with this kind of energy, there are theoretically these specific kinds of possibilities or probabilities. And usually, well, especially like if we're doing, if I'm trying to predict, say, what's going to happen tomorrow, typically I can't really say like specifically what will happen, but I can definitely give a generalized idea of what is very, very likely to happen. And so I think astrology is valuable, at least in that sense, no matter what, even if what Seth is saying is true, that it's basically incomplete. But I don't know that. But then, of course, to be fair, I'm basically an astrologer myself, I guess, if I would qualify for that after 3+ years of intense study of it. So of course I'm going to stick with astrology or be a proponent of it. But yeah, I guess that's about it. It's interesting that, as I observed last week, I was almost expecting Seth to largely sort of disagree with me about astrology, but as it turned out, he pretty much the stuff that he was pointing out that was wrong with it is stuff that I've pointed out that was wrong with it, like misassumptions, misunderstandings, and he basically nearly does agree with me on astrology, which I was not expecting. But anyway, that's about it. I hope everyone has a great night. Thanks for tuning in. If you're in a country where the clocks just changed, I hope you're adjusting well to the new time frame. I know that I'm still tired as hell from it, but I'm sure I'll adjust soon enough. And yeah, I will see you next week with more Seth material, and probably later this week with other streams too. So thanks again, and bye for now.